Fantomas? Good question. We don't quite find out over the course of the series of novels. Various films haven't really given him what you might call an origin story. You're familiar with how Bruce Wayne became Batman, for instance. Whereas with Fantomas, we never even really find out his real name. We're told various things about him, but they all turn out to be lies, or possibly lies. Which I think is one of the things that made the character so appealing, as it were, to highbrows, the surrealists who were great fans of the original pulp novels, because Fantomas is a mystery without an answer. There are precedents in the literature, as it were. It's possible from one level that Herman Melville's The Confidence Man was floating around in the back of the minds of Marcel Alain and Pierre Souvestre when they wrote the first Fantomas books, although more likely they were thinking of famous master villains from previous fiction. Obviously Sherlock Holmes' enemy, Professor Moriarty, is quite like Fantomas in that he's the master of a huge evil organization of bad guys who are doing terrible things. Although Fantomas' love of dressing up as other people is more like Sherlock Holmes himself. There were French precedents for this. There was, I suppose, the gentleman thief Arsène Lupin, who was almost a rival of Fantomas in publishing terms, was another precedent. He was a flamboyant heroic outlaw, rather like the British character Raffles, who robbed the rich and kept some of it, but had a kind of Robin Hood attitude. He was sort of gallant and rescued ladies in distress, and often he was pitted against other villains who were even worse than he was. So although he was a casual murderer and a habitual thief, Arsène Lupin was a hero rather than a villain. What's interesting about Fantomas is that he's unapologetically a bad guy, but he gets away with it at the end of the first book and all the subsequent novels, partly in order to keep the story going, but partly because he had been established as a character who was so powerful, so scary, so strong, and so resourceful, and had such support from his organisation of fanatically loyal minions, that the poor, struggling forces of good, who were represented by Inspector Juvet of the Sûreté, could never catch up with him. Interestingly, probably the most recent cultural appearance of these characters has been through a parody in the Pink Panther films, in which Inspector Clouseau is always after a fabulous jewel thief called the Phantom, and Inspector Clouseau is kind of like the ultimate evolution of Inspector Juvet, and of course he's an idiot, so he has no chance at all of getting the villain. In fact, the first Pink Panther film ends with Clouseau arrested and it being assumed that he is the Phantom, which happened to Inspector Juvet more than once. If you read the first novel, Fantomas, on its own, it's entirely possible that Inspector Juvet is Fantomas, which it seems to be what people start to think. Later on in the saga, it's definitively proved that he isn't. However, you can also argue that almost nothing is definitively proved in the Fantomas novels, because, as the name suggests, he is a phantom. He is impossible to catch. Fantomas was created by two writers, Pierre Souvestre, who was the senior partner of the team, and Marcel Alain, who was a journalist who was actually sent to interview Pierre Souvestre, and they ended up collaborating on quite a long string of novels. It's the Fantomas saga is one of those things that isn't quite an authored text in the way that we normally think of. It was a commission work. An editor came to these two guys and said, "We want to do a magazine," in effect, although not quite a magazine in the way we understand it. It's more like a series of novels, but they were published monthly. And basically, Souvestre and Alain were hired to come up with this. They came up with an outline. They came up with a name. Their original name was Fantomas, M-U-S, rather than M-A-S. But their publisher misread it on their synopsis, and so forever after it's been Fantomas. So even from the beginning they had no control over what their character was called. They wrote I think something like over 30 novels featuring Fantomas in a period of under 3 years. They wrote a book a month, and not insubstantial novels. There are other pulp writers later doing the Doc Savage novels or The Shadow, who wrote things that are barely novel length, 45, 50,000 words. The Fantomas books are big, thick books, and they were written in a strange way, in collaborative terms. What they would do is they would get together, rough out the plot in the first week of the month, and one of the important things they did was when they thought of the plot, they thought of an exciting event that would go on the cover. So they then gave that to the cover artist, who was beavering away for the next bit, and then they would split up and write alternate chapters each without talking to each other, which gives the books this strange on-off feel, because literally you have two voices, and then in the final week they would scribble together the bits that link together each other's chapters, which they had not until then read. And maybe they caught some of the inconsistencies which would eventually turn up. Maybe they didn't, which is one of the reasons why the books have this serial-like feel. I mean, they're very much series of exciting incidents rather than actual plots. If you read the books strung together, they feel like one long work. There isn't really a beginning or end. It's rather like the way sequels were produced in the 80s and 90s. If you look at, say, the Nightmare on Elm Street films back to back, the actual endings of the movies don't count. They're always taken away, and you end up with this long string of set pieces, which is what the Fantomas saga is. And each set piece basically is Fantomas commits some horrible atrocity and gets away with it. And then maybe alternately Juve sets a trap for Fantomas that he escapes from. And you would think that repetition would set in quite early, and there are themes that come up. However, I think throughout the series and then the film serial, there's this rising strange arc of bizarre, striking, sometimes horrific, sometimes blackly comic incident, and it's what's called string of pearls plotting. You take all these great things, you hang them together, not with a particularly strong overall narrative, and in a strange way, that's more like life than the more polished attempts to turn out a novel. I mean, you could argue that as the 20th century was speeding up, and these books were written just before World War I, this represented how people felt about the world, and particularly, when you take in the fact that these were published like newspapers and then almost instantly turned into films, which was the hot new medium then. If you were, going to movies that were about an hour long in 1912, that was like being on the absolute cutting edge of technology. That was like somebody who's out there, downloading stuff from the internet and doing their own mix or whatever, whatever the current cutting edge technology is. That it was a mass medium, but it was also an exciting medium, a technological medium, and I think that buzzes throughout the whole Fantomas saga, this sense of innovation, excitement, being overtaken by events. But also with the war coming up, the possibility that huge disaster is about to come too, which is why morality doesn't count for these people, because who knows, they are all going to die. I mean, in fact, Pierre Silvestre, the co-creator of Fantomas, was struck by influenza in 1914 and died. His sidekick, Marcel Alain, who married his partner's widow, did continue the series on later. Connoisseurs reckon that the later single-authored books aren't quite as good as the kind of the ones where the two people are arguing. And the series does lead up until our vision of the 20th century's first great cataclysm. Well, the books were an instant success in popular terms. They wouldn't have run for 32 straight months if they hadn't been. They were devoured by fans of sensation fiction. French sensation fiction was really big at the time. This is the era of Gaston Leroux, who wrote The Phantom of the Opera, various other big name thriller writers were becoming very successful, and Alain Silvestre got straight in there and were hugely popular. I suppose the books had the impact that a big hit TV series has now. People would follow the adventures. They would pick the new Fantomas up every month. They were not the kind of books that necessarily appealed to the critical establishment, although, interestingly, almost everybody involved in the creation of Fantomas was a very right-wing conservative characters. Up until Louis Feuillade, who directed the films, they were all solid bourgeois establishment people, very much in favour of the monarchy, very Catholic, but somehow they channeled, maybe through this strange working method of just writing without thinking, undercurrents of the time that were appealing at once to the masses, the kind of people who would go and see action movies now, but also to, as it were, oppositional intellectuals, not the stuffy elder statesmen of French letters, but the surrealists. James Joyce was apparently a big fan. René Magritte drew Fantomas. Later, Jean Cocteau really picked it up and liked it. And I think what those people liked was the idea that Fantomas was almost like automatic writing, that Alain Silvestre were working so hard and so fast that they didn't have time to think about what they were doing, and they tapped into some great unconscious. I mean, this is a sort of Jungian approach to what Fantomas was. But I think at the time, I suspect that the original publishers and writers of Fantomas found all that side of things a bit embarrassing and sort of scratched their heads. And in the way that these days the makers of popular films tend to resent it when academics go and say that actually no, there's really interesting stuff going. So you often hear filmmakers or writers say, I just tell stories, or I don't have time for all this deep inner meaning stuff. And that you look at the books and they definitely do have all this stuff going on. In the background, but I think the Fantomas as a franchise, as a name, has lasted because of its highbrow fans. We now know about Fantomas because James Joyce and Cocteau were big fans. At the time, that was not an important strand of the approach. At the time, it was the huge popular success which was what made Fantomas famous, and it's almost the first case. Before D.W. Griffith was buying a book to make Birth of the Nation, French film companies were in a bidding war to the rights to make a Fantomas film. Gaumont, who still exist, were the lucky winners. I mean, they came up with the most money and produced the Fantomas serial while the books were still running. So it was a real, cutting edge stuff. But it's also it's the first incident of the film industry doing what it does today. Catching a hot topic, getting it's like you buy the Da Vinci Code and get the film out before everybody turns on the book. And I see that's exactly what happened with Fantomas. The name was there. Almost, the name would have been enough. So the man who got to direct the Fantomas films was Louis Feuillade, and he got that job basically because he was the director at Gaumont. You look at his credits, he made 800 films. Now, some of them weren't very long, but 800 titles is still something that's inconceivable as a filmography now. At his height, he must have been making a film a week. Some of them were films that were probably shot in an afternoon. And this was at a time when people hadn't quite worked out what the job of a film director was. Previously, you had films that tended to be authored by inventors. I mean, Edison is listed as the director of a whole bunch of films that he merely financed. And it was an era where filmmakers tended to be entrepreneurs. Georges Méliès in France was a magician. Charlie Chaplin became a director as a side effect of his being a film star. There had been directors before, and people like Edwin Porter in America, D.W. Griffith was certainly well on his way to becoming the first proper film auteur. But Feuillade was a director in the sense that a foreman runs a factory. He turned up, he got everybody together, he pointed the camera, he told people what to do, and then he might not even have been in the building when they did the rest of it. Again, as with the writing of the books, there's almost a sense of somebody who was tapping into the unconscious while working. Fouillade was a traditional Catholic bourgeois fellow who would not seem to have had any sympathies with the anarchic streak of his own best films, although I suspect there's a change in him. After he made the Fantomas films, he went off to war like all good Frenchmen did in 1914. But he was, I suppose, lucky in that he was quickly wounded and invalided out and spent the rest of the war making more films. He lasted until the mid-20s when he died, but he did follow up Fantomas with a series of similar works, Judek's Timin and maybe his masterpiece Les Vampires, which are also hooded master fiend superhero action mystery adventure type movies, and develop the themes of Fantomas in a way, and it's possible that I'm reading too much into this, but I suspect his own wartime experiences were enough of a shock to give the later films a sort of an added edge. In Fantomas, it's almost as if he's playing games. It is charades, it is dress up. But in the later films, the kind of brutality and the horror is much more serious. Of course, when you're making a series of films around one character, these days there would be a great deal of fuss about the casting of Fantomas. Back then, I think they just looked around who was around the studio and picked somebody who could fit in. The guy René Navarre, who is by default the star of this series, had a long, distinguished French film career. But of course, it's rather a poisoned chalice of a role because Fantomas very rarely shows his actual face, which is what film stars want to get on the screen as much as they can. For much of the time, Fantomas is in disguise, and various other people step in. Who knows? Is it René Navarre all the time? Maybe it is. In the novels, there's a possibility that Fantomas is several people. Obviously, when they made the films, they had to make a decision that it would be one person. When the Fantomas character was revived in the 1960s, one actor, Jean Marais, played Fantomas and his arch enemy Fandor, the heroic journalist who assists Inspector Jouvet, which even blurred the sense of identities much more. And in those films, Fantomas, when he is in disguise, is played by the other actors he's disguised as. So everybody gets a chance to be Fantomas. In the original movie, René Navarre is Fantomas throughout, and yet he doesn't really emerge as that much of a personality. He's much more striking in masks than he is as himself, which may even be a philosophical point. There is something interesting about that in the end, the masked mystery man has no identity. He is the man without a face, without a name. And all the names we give and all the faces we see aren't real. Again, I suspect this is something that really appealed to the intellectual, the surreal imagination, the idea that the modern man was in the end nobody. And from a more purely sort of bloody-minded approach, anarchists loved the idea that Fantomas spent most of his time disguised as a proper bourgeois. Quite often Fantomas turns up pretending to be a policeman or a judge, investigating magistrate in France. He even turns up as an American detective called Tom Bob, which must be a French idea of an American name. And so there's the sense that anybody could be Fantomas. And he is not necessarily an oppositional character. He's not necessarily a villain in that sense. He might even be the establishment. His evil might be the evil of the ruling classes rather than a defiance of them. And so I think that creeps through a lot. I think we see Fantomas' influence seeps throughout cinema. I mean, it's the origin of a type of cinema that's still with us, isn't it? The comic book adventure, I suppose we can say. I mean, it's there in the Bond films, Indiana Jones, the parade of superhero pictures or whatever. But unlike those movies, it is predicated on the adventures of a villain. There are heroes in Fantomas, but we don't really get close to them. And I think that was a style that maybe we still have. You could see that all the Bond films are structured around their bad guys rather than the continuing hero who crops up to defeat, and maybe as a suggestion that all the Bond villains are the same person with different flamboyant eccentricities. After Fantomas, there were several other major continuing bad guy characters in film and fiction. Fu Manchu, Sax Rohmer's Yellow Peril character, is obviously a kind of Fantomas, although not somebody who can disguise himself particularly well. But Dr. Mabuse, the German equivalent of Fantomas, who was created in the early 1920s in very similar books to the Fantomas books, and was then brought to the screen by Fritz Lang in a bunch of silent pictures and then a talkie. He is very much the German version of Fantomas. There are great similarities between their modus operandi. Mabuse also lives for disguises. He may not even be Dr. Mabuse. That's just one of his names. And he also infiltrates society and yet epitomizes its ills. I think in that case, Mabuse is a direct lift from Fantomas, but there are many other characters which just evoke or echo Fantomas. There was an Italian comic book character in the 60s called Diabolic, who was filmed by Mario Bava and Dino De Laurentiis in the late 60s, a film with John Philip Law about him. And that's very Fantomas-like in feel. And when Fantomas was revived in the 1960s, the films looked a lot like the early Bond films. So again, that style was feeding into itself. I mean, it's a very small, crowded area, and maybe we now see Fantomas as the granddaddy, the progenitor of a particular style of pulp surrealism. I think we can say it's a popular style, but it's not a negligible style. It is something that maybe makes sense given 20th century and now 21st century history. Maybe the melodramatic and the bizarre, the shocking, the surprising, the frightening, maybe that's now the general tone of the times, and so therefore films need to reflect that. Maybe that's actually more realistic than I don't know, Look Back in Anger or The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. Maybe we're all the children of Fantomas now, rather than the heirs to a naturalistic setting. And Fantomas has always been a great hero to those who feel that the cinema is a machine for dreams, for excitement, for the subconscious, rather than following the Lumiere approach that cinema is there to record life.